The greatest empires in history were held together by secrets, not just soldiers. Long before digital surveillance, ancient rulers built vast, invisible information networks that functioned as the true nervous systems of their realms. By the end of this exploration, you will understand how these covert intelligence networks fundamentally shaped the ancient world and created a hidden blueprint for power that still operates today. How did an emperor in Rome know about a brewing rebellion in Egypt? Who were the mysterious agents trusted with messages that could start or stop a war? We will uncover the silent architects who worked in the shadows, from the royal inspectors of Persia to the merchant spies of the Silk Road, whose decisions influenced the lives of millions. What do you believe is the true price of maintaining an empire? An emperor stands before a map, his realm stretching across continents, a mosaic of cities and deserts and restless frontiers. Conquest had built this empire, but a quiet, chilling realization now held it together. Armies could seize land, but they could not see around every corner or hear the whispers in a distant marketplace. To govern such a vast and varied world, a ruler needed a different kind of power. He needed to see without being seen, to know what was spoken in private rooms 1,000 miles away. This was the birth of a new kind of infrastructure, one built not from stone and mortar, but from secrets and trust. It was the understanding that information, more than gold or legions, was the ultimate currency of control. This is our core idea. These covert intelligence networks were not a side project or a luxury for ancient states. They were as critical to imperial survival as paved roads or tax collectors. They formed the administrative and military nervous system of an empire, a hidden web that allowed a central authority to perceive threats, manage governors, and project power far beyond the immediate reach of its soldiers. But what did covert intelligence actually mean in the ancient world? It was a comprehensive system. It meant espionage, planting agents to gather secrets. It meant counterintelligence, rooting out the spies of rivals. It involved the careful crafting of disinformation to mislead enemies. And above all, it demanded a secure, rapid method of communication, a way to move a critical message faster than rebellion could spread. Historians like Adrian Goldsworthy note that for Rome, this intelligence apparatus was woven into the very fabric of provincial governance. Governors were expected to be the eyes and ears of the emperor, their reports forming a constant, if uneven, stream of information. But philosophy and manuals for statecraft took this idea even further. Centuries earlier in the East, a seminal text called the Arthashastra, attributed to the advisor Kautilya, laid out a breathtakingly sophisticated vision of state intelligence. It detailed entire categories of spies, from wandering ascetics to trusted merchants, each assigned to monitor different levels of society. This was not just theory, it was a recognized pillar of statecraft. We can break down the function of these networks into three essential pillars. The first was collection, the work of the spies themselves. The second was analysis, the role of trusted advisors in a ruler's court who could sift rumor from fact and discern a true threat. The third was action, the deployment of agents who could quietly resolve a problem, perhaps through diplomacy, bribery, or other discreet means, long before it required an army. Consider the famous Persian royal road, stretching over 1,600 miles from the heart of Iran to the coast of Anatolia. We often praise it as a marvel of trade, which it was. But its greater purpose was strategic. Couriers could travel its entire length in just 7 days, a staggering speed for the ancient world. This was not primarily for merchants. This was an information highway for the king's eyes and ears, the royal inspectors who reported directly to the king. A governor plotting treason would find his plans discovered, and a royal regiment arriving at his doorstep with dismaying speed. The road was the visible spine, but the intelligence flowing along it was the lifeblood. These invisible threads of information, of whispered reports and coded messages, are what truly wove these vast and fragile empires into a single, manageable tapestry. The royal road was the artery, but the eyes and the ears of the king were the lifeblood coursing through it. To understand the first truly systematic intelligence network, we must look to the Achaemenid Persian Empire under rulers like Darius I. This was a realm of staggering scale, governing lands from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean Sea, a mosaic of dozens of cultures and languages. A single ruler in a palace at Persepolis could not possibly oversee such a domain through force alone. His genius was in creating a system of oversight that made his presence felt everywhere, even when he was nowhere to be seen. This was the core known as the eyes and the ears of the king. They were not mythical figures but high-ranking officials, often royal kinsmen or nobles of unquestioned loyalty, who answered directly and only to the monarch himself. Their title says it all. They were the sensory organs of the empire, traveling constantly to see and hear what the king could not. Their primary mission was to audit the satraps, the provincial governors who wielded immense local power. A satrap controlled his own army and treasury, a necessary arrangement for managing a distant territory, but one that carried the constant risk of rebellion or corruption. The eyes and ears would arrive unannounced, their authority absolute. They reviewed financial records, inspected military readiness, and listened carefully to the whispers of the local populace. The Greek historian Herodotus, while often writing from an outsider's perspective, recorded the formidable reputation of these agents. They combined the roles of a royal auditor and a master intelligence officer. Their power was both practical and profoundly psychological. A satrap never knew when one might appear at his gate or who among his own court might be providing information. This created a powerful deterrent against disloyalty, a quiet understanding that the palace was always watching. Their effectiveness relied on the empire's groundbreaking infrastructure. The royal road, with its well-guarded relay stations stocked with fresh horses, allowed these inspectors to move with incredible speed. A message about unrest or deception could reach the king in a matter of days, not months. They also employed sophisticated methods for secure communication. Messages were often sealed with the king's own signet in clay, a tamper-proof method for the time. They cultivated networks of local informants, from merchants to minor officials, who provided ground-level truth that a satrap's official reports might obscure. We can picture a scenario that likely played out more than once. A satrap, far from the capital, begins to skim a portion of the royal tribute for his own treasury, or makes quiet alliances with local chieftains. He feels secure in his distance, but an eye of the king, traveling the road on a routine inspection, hears a stray comment from a disgruntled tax collector or notices a discrepancy in the grain stores. He sends a sealed report via the royal post. Before the satrap can solidify his plans, he receives new orders from the king, or worse, finds a regiment of the king's personal guard at his door. The plot is dissolved not by a costly war, but by a timely piece of information. This system established the model. It proved that a centralized, mobile intelligence service could bind a vast empire together, creating a balance between local authority and ultimate royal control. The Persian example became a textbook for every empire that followed, a silent lesson in the art of governing through knowledge. The Persian model demonstrated that intelligence could maintain an empire, but one ancient advisor believed it could actually build one from nothing. In the turbulent world of the Indian subcontinent, a brilliant and ruthless strategist named Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, authored a text that would become the definitive manual for state power. His work, the Arthashastra, written over 2,300 years ago, is not merely a philosophical treatise. It is a practical, often chilling, guidebook for running a kingdom, and it dedicates entire chapters to the science of espionage, treating it with the same systematic rigor as finance or agriculture. For Chanakya, spying was not a dark art relegated to the shadows. It was a fundamental pillar of statecraft, the essential tool for a king's survival and expansion. His patron, Chandragupta Maurya, used these very principles to forge the vast Mauryan Empire, one of the largest and most sophisticated the ancient world had ever seen. At the heart of this system was the concept of the Sansthan, a vast and compartmentalized spy network. Unlike the Persian Eyes, who were high-ranking officials, the Mauryan network was designed to be invisible, woven into the very fabric of society. Chanakya outlined detailed categories of agents, each with a specific cover and function. There was the Kapatika, a wandering ascetic or holy man, whose spiritual guise allowed him to move between villages and gather gossip without suspicion. The Yudhasthita was a merchant or trader, his business providing the perfect excuse to travel to rival kingdoms and observe troop movements or economic conditions. Then there was the Grihapataka, a settled householder who would blend into a community, listening to the concerns and loyalties of his neighbors. This network served a dual, all-encompassing purpose. Internally, it was a tool for supreme control. Spies were deployed to monitor the king's own ministers, generals, and even family members, reporting on corruption, dissent, or ambition. Externally, agents infiltrated rival courts, mapping their weaknesses and alliances, turning the fog of war into a clear picture for the Mauryan ruler. The Arthashastra goes into remarkable technical detail. It describes early forms of cryptography, suggesting messages could be written in secret codes or with invisible inks made from plant juices. It outlines procedures for dead drops, where information could be left in a hollow tree or a specific brick in a wall. The manual even advises on the psychological profiling of potential agents, assessing their loyalty, intelligence, and ability to maintain a cover story. The legendary rise of Chandragupta Maurya himself is the ultimate case study. Historical accounts suggest Chanakya orchestrated a vast intelligence operation against the reigning Nanda dynasty. His spies would have gathered critical information on the Nanda treasury, the morale of their troops, and the grievances of their subjects. They likely spread disinformation to weaken the ruling family's support and identified key allies who could be turned. This covert campaign, a war fought in whispers and shadows, laid the groundwork for the military conquest that followed. It was intelligence that identified the crack in the wall before the first battering ram was ever built. What Chanakya understood, and what the Arthashastra so coldly codifies, is that information is the ultimate strategic resource. He built a philosophy where every person in the kingdom was a potential source, and every silence held a potential secret. This was not just about catching traitors, it was about shaping reality itself, guiding the perceptions of friends and foes alike to secure a throne that seemed, to the outside world, unshakable. Rome's genius lay in taking a practical need and turning it into an instrument of power. In the early Republic, military scouts called explorators and speculators provided tactical intelligence on the battlefield. But as the empire expanded from Britain to Syria, managing information became a strategic imperative. The solution emerged not from the shadows of the spy, but from the granaries of the legion. Meet the Frumentarii. Their name came from frumentum, the Latin word for grain. Originally, they were simple quartermasters, soldiers tasked with securing wheat supplies for the army. This was a vital, mundane job that required them to travel constantly across provinces, dealing with local officials and merchants. They knew the roads, the people, and the bureaucratic machinery better than almost anyone. Somewhere in the 1st century, a clever emperor, perhaps Domitian, saw their potential. These unassuming supply clerks were the perfect cover. Who would suspect the man checking on the grain reserves of also checking on the loyalty of a governor? Their official duty to collect the annona, a grain tax for the army, gave them legitimate reason to enter any town, audit any record, and question any official. They were transformed from logistics officers into the empire's first institutionalized secret service. Historian Anthony Burley notes that under emperors like Hadrian, a ruler known for his hands-on governance, the Frumentarii became the long arm of the palace. Their duties expanded far beyond tax collection. They were the trusted couriers for the most sensitive imperial communications, carrying sealed orders that could appoint or depose a provincial leader. They conducted covert investigations, rooting out corruption or sedition, and in the darkest interpretation of their role, they served as the emperor's personal enforcers, capable of discreetly removing political opponents without the scandal of a public trial. Their presence cast a long shadow. A provincial governor enjoying the trappings of his power might receive a routine visit from a frumentarius. The agent would review the accounts, ask seemingly innocent questions about local affairs, and then depart. Weeks later, the governor could be summoned to Rome or quietly replaced, never quite knowing which whispered complaint or financial discrepancy had triggered his downfall. The system was brutally efficient, but it bred deep resentment. To many Romans, especially the senatorial class, the Frumentarii were not protectors of the state but feared informers and assassins, a symbol of imperial overreach. This controversy led to a reform in the later empire. The Frumentarii were disbanded in the 3rd century, only to be replaced by a new corps, the agents in rebus, the agents of affairs. These men were even more integrated into the imperial machinery, overseeing the vast state postal service, the cursus publicus. This control over the flow of official messages gave them immense power, allowing them to monitor all official communication and delay or intercept anything deemed suspicious. They became the administrative nerve center of the late Roman state. From grain clerks to masters of the imperial post, Rome's journey shows the formalization of covert power. It was no longer just about individual spies, but about building intelligence directly into the bureaucracy, turning everyday functions like supply and mail into channels for control. This was the empire thinking like a machine, ensuring that every road, every shipment, and every letter could also serve the silent purpose of holding everything together. Dust settled on a caravan of 100 camels, winding through a mountain pass that connected the courts of China to the markets of Persia. To the tax collector at the next oasis, this was a shipment of silk and jade. But to the imperial advisor reading a coded report months later, it was something far more valuable. The Silk Road was the world's first great information superhighway, a sprawling network where commerce, culture, and covert intelligence became indistinguishable. Historian Peter Frankopan emphasizes that these routes were never just about luxury goods. They were the central nervous system of Eurasian geopolitics. For empires separated by vast deserts and towering peaks, the merchant who knew the safe paths and local rulers was not just a trader, he was a priceless geopolitical asset. These empires, from Han China to Parthia and distant Rome, lacked permanent embassies in each other's capitals, so they relied on the constant flow of people along the Silk Road to be their eyes and ears. A merchant dealing in spices in a Bactrian city would naturally learn about troop movements, harvest failures, or a change in local leadership. This information, when carried back to his homeland, transformed him from a simple businessman into an unwitting intelligence agent for his state. The most famous early example is the Chinese envoy Zhang Qian, sent west by Emperor Wu of Han in the 2nd century BCE. His official mission was to find allies against the Confederation of the Xiongnu, a constant challenge on China's northern frontier. But his journey was a masterclass in strategic reconnaissance. For over a decade, even after being captured, he meticulously recorded everything he saw: the strength of Central Asian kingdoms, their resources, their political alliances, and their trade routes. When he finally returned, his detailed reports provided the Han court with its first reliable map of the world beyond its borders, enabling decades of expanded influence and diplomacy. His travels were a state-sponsored intelligence mission disguised as a diplomatic overture. Centuries later, another type of traveler carried knowledge back to imperial centers, the Buddhist monk. A figure like Xuanzang, who made an epic journey from Tang China to India in the 7th century, was driven by faith and scholarship. Yet the detailed accounts he brought back of the lands, languages, and political structures of dozens of kingdoms along his route were a treasure trove of cultural and political intelligence for the Tang court. His observations helped shape foreign policy and strategic understanding of a complex region. This system reached its peak of efficiency under the Mongol Empire, which unified the entire Silk Road under a single authority. Genghis Khan and his successors established the Yam, a revolutionary courier network of relay stations spaced a day's ride apart. Fresh horses and riders waited at each post, allowing a single message to race from the Danube to the Yellow River in a matter of weeks. While this system powered the administration of history's largest contiguous land empire, it also supercharged its intelligence capabilities. Officials and spies could move with unprecedented speed, and information from the farthest reaches of the empire flowed directly to the Great Khan. The Silk Road thus reveals a fundamental truth. In a world without satellites or instant communication, the flow of goods and the flow of secrets traveled along the same paths. The trust built between a merchant and his contacts, the cultural exchange between monks and scholars, all created channels that empires could quietly exploit. Commerce built the road, but intelligence made it a tool of power, binding continents together with threads of whispered knowledge carried on the wind alongside the scent of spices and silk. A message sent across an empire was a treasure waiting to be stolen. Every courier traveling a lonely road, every ship crossing a treacherous sea, carried not just words but potential catastrophe if those words fell into the wrong hands. To protect their secrets, ancient intelligence networks had to become masters of illusion, developing two brilliant arts: cryptography to scramble a message's meaning, and steganography to hide its very existence. These were not just clever tricks, they were the essential tools that kept the wheels of empire turning in silence. Let us start with a simple but devastatingly effective device, the scytale. Used famously by Spartan generals, it consisted of a wooden rod of a precise diameter. A messenger would wrap a thin strip of leather or parchment spirally around the rod, and then write his message lengthwise along it. When unwound, the strip appeared to hold only a random, meaningless sequence of letters. But when the recipient, who possessed an identical rod, wrapped the strip around it, the letters aligned perfectly to reveal the original command. This was steganography in its purest form. The message was not encoded, it was concealed within apparent chaos. The Romans refined this art of secrecy with one of history's most famous ciphers, attributed to Julius Caesar. In his method, known today as the Caesar shift cipher, each letter in the message was replaced by a letter a fixed number of positions down the alphabet. For instance, with a shift of 3, A became D, B became E, and so on. To an interceptor, the captured text looked like gibberish, but to a commander with the key, it was a clear battle plan. This was cryptography, transforming the message itself into a puzzle only the intended recipient could solve. But ingenuity did not stop there. Greek agents employed a brilliant double-layered technique using wax tablets. A spy would scratch his true message into the wooden surface of a tablet, then pour wax over it to create a smooth, fresh surface. On this new wax layer, he would inscribe an innocuous cover message, perhaps a merchant's inventory or a personal letter. The recipient would simply melt or scrape away the wax to reveal the secret intelligence hidden beneath. This method perfectly combined both arts. The cover story provided steganographic concealment, while the act of hiding the true text was itself a cryptographic step. The natural world provided another invisible ally, invisible inks. Writers across cultures discovered that the juices of certain fruits, like lemons or onions or even plain milk, could be used to write messages that were completely invisible once dry. The paper appeared blank. Only when heated gently near a flame would the organic compounds caramelize, causing the hidden writing to brown and appear as if by magic. This allowed a seemingly innocent piece of correspondence, a shopping list or a poem, to carry a second, far more sensitive text right under a censor's nose. Perhaps the most daring example of steganography comes from the historian Herodotus. He recounts how a Persian noble, facing a communication blockade, needed to send a warning about an impending invasion. He shaved the head of his most trusted slave, tattooed the secret message directly onto the scalp, and then waited for the hair to grow back completely, concealing the text. The slave, now looking like any other traveler, journeyed to his destination, shaved his head once more, and delivered the warning physically etched onto his skin. This story, whether entirely factual or not, captures the extreme lengths and human ingenuity invested in moving information unseen. From India's complex substitution ciphers described in the Kama Sutra to the sophisticated cryptographic analyses developed by Arab scholars like Al-Kindi, who pioneered frequency analysis to break codes, the ancient world was engaged in a silent, relentless arms race of secrecy. Every intercepted courier forced a new innovation. These methods were the vital encryption protocols of their day, ensuring that a command from a king or a report from a spy reached its destination not just quickly but intact. They remind us that the battle for control was often won not by the sword that was seen, but by the letter that was not. A servant pours wine for a king, his hands steady, his expression blank. He hears every word of the war council, a trusted fixture in the royal household. But his true master lives in a rival palace 1,000 miles away. This was the ultimate human gamble of ancient intelligence, the double agent living a lie. For all the brilliant systems of roads and ciphers, the entire structure rested on the fragile, unpredictable psychology of individual people. How did you recruit someone to live a life of perpetual deception, and more crucially, how did you ensure they would not turn that deception against you? The ancient manuals of statecraft understood that the most effective spy was not necessarily the most skilled fighter, but the one whose deepest needs or fears could be expertly managed. The Arthashastra is brutally pragmatic on this point. It advises rulers to recruit from specific, vulnerable profiles. The ideal candidate might be a person facing financial ruin, whose greed could be leveraged with promises of wealth. Another might be someone nursing a deep personal grievance against the target, whose anger could be channeled into loyalty. The text even suggests recruiting those who are utterly fearless, or those facing a severe punishment, for whom espionage offered a dangerous but possible path to redemption. Recruitment was a science of exploiting human weakness, but retention was an art of balancing complex pressures. Once an agent was in place, the controller had to maintain their allegiance through a careful mix of carrot and stick. Financial reward was the most straightforward method, a steady stream of silver or land grants that made the agent's new life more comfortable than his old one. But money alone was unreliable. Blackmail was a more powerful bond. A controller might ensure the agent committed an irreversible act against his own people, a crime that, if discovered, would guarantee his execution. This made the spy's survival inextricably linked to the success of his foreign handlers. For some, ideological persuasion was the strongest glue. A spy might be convinced he was serving a greater cause, a more righteous king, or the promise of a unified empire that would bring peace. This required a deep understanding of the agent's personal beliefs and values, a psychological manipulation far more sophisticated than simple bribery. Yet the greatest challenge was the mental landscape of the spy themselves. To be effective, they had to construct a watertight legend, a false life story with convincing details, relatives, and a past that could withstand casual inquiry. They had to remember their lies at all times, to never slip in fatigue or stress. They lived in constant isolation, unable to share their true thoughts or fears with anyone around them, surrounded by people they were secretly betraying. The emotional toll of this duplicity must have been immense, a relentless pressure that could break even the strongest will. Consider the agent planted as a servant, the scenario from our opening. For years, he performs mundane duties, blending into the background. He learns the routines of the palace, the personalities of the advisors, the king's private worries. Every piece of information he sends back is a betrayal of the household that feeds and shelters him. He might develop genuine affection for the very people he is undermining. His loyalty is perpetually divided, a currency traded between two masters, and the price of a single mistake is not just his own death, but the collapse of a network and the outbreak of a war. This psychological dimension adds a profound layer of complexity to our understanding of these networks. They were not cold, impersonal machines. They were ecosystems of human emotion, built on manipulated hope, cultivated resentment, and profound loneliness. The silent threads that held empires together were spun from the raw material of human vulnerability, woven by handlers who understood that the deepest secrets of state were often unlocked not by force, but by understanding the secret fears and desires of a single, seemingly insignificant person. A general studies his battle plans by lamplight, then calls for a captured enemy scout to be brought before him. He speaks freely of a false attack at dawn on the eastern ridge, knowing the terrified prisoner will repeat every word upon his release. This was not an oversight, it was the final, masterful move in the silent war. For every network of spies a kingdom built, it had to construct an even more cunning defense, a world of mirrors and traps known as counterintelligence. If espionage was the invisible sword, counterintelligence was the unseen shield, and often the sharper weapon of the two. The ancient strategist Sun Tzu stated it plainly in The Art of War: all warfare is based on deception. To protect their own secrets and corrupt the intelligence of their foes, empires developed a ruthless playbook of psychological warfare. The first line of defense was internal purification, the loyalty purge. A ruler suspecting infiltration would order sudden investigations, testing the allegiance of his own courtiers and officials. In Rome, the fear of the Frumentarii served this purpose, creating an atmosphere where betrayal seemed too risky. More proactive measures involved the careful planting of disinformation. A false map might be left where an enemy agent was sure to find it, or a scribe would be allowed to overhear a fabricated conversation between generals. The goal was to poison the enemy's decision-making at the source. Then came the most delicate operation, the double agent. Instead of executing a captured spy, a counterintelligence officer would turn him, offering wealth or threatening severe consequences. This now loyal turncoat would return to his original masters, feeding them a steady stream of credible but ultimately false information, all while secretly reporting their true intentions back to his new handlers. To identify unknown spies, security services would set honeypot traps. A minor official with access to seemingly vital documents would be left vulnerable to approach, his movements closely watched to see who contacted him. The Romans, when deception failed, employed harsh methods to extract truth. A captured agent faced interrogation, with historians noting that the threat of severe punishment was a tool to compel cooperation, a grim reality of ancient conflict. Yet physical measures were only one part of the puzzle. The Byzantine Empire, inheritor of Rome's bureaucratic legacy, perfected a defensive system of administrative complexity. They compartmentalized information so thoroughly that no single official, even a high-ranking minister, possessed the complete picture of a military campaign or diplomatic initiative. This made it exponentially harder for a spy to steal anything of decisive value, A legendary example of strategic deception comes from the Peloponnesian War. The Spartan commander Brasidas sought to capture the well-fortified city of Amphipolis. He knew a direct assault would fail, so he spread disinformation that he was only interested in a weaker ally nearby, lulling the city's defenders into a false sense of security. He then orchestrated a feigned retreat with part of his force, tricking the Amphipolitans into leaving their walls to pursue what they thought was a fleeing enemy. At the perfect moment, Brasidas wheeled his main army around, striking the exposed city and securing a bloodless victory. His triumph was won not on the battlefield, but in the minds of his opponents days before the first soldier moved. This constant, interactive game of feint and counter-feint reveals ancient intelligence as a dynamic dialogue in the dark. It was a high-stakes chess match where every piece was a person, every move was a lie, and checkmate was delivered not with a sword, but with a carefully crafted illusion that the enemy believed was their own brilliant idea. The smoke of incense and the murmur of 100 languages filled the sacred precinct, a holy chaos where a merchant from Lydia might brush shoulders with an Egyptian diplomat. In the ancient world, the most sensitive secrets were often exchanged not in guarded war rooms, but in the echoing halls of temples and under the auspices of diplomatic immunity. Religious institutions and diplomatic missions provided the perfect, sanctioned cover for intelligence work, offering a protected space where spies could operate in plain sight. Historians of ancient diplomacy note that the roles of priest, ambassador, and spy were frequently intertwined, a blurring of lines that modern states would find startling. An ambassador's formal duty was to deliver messages and negotiate treaties, but his unspoken mandate was always to listen, to observe, and to report back everything he saw and heard. He moved in the highest circles, attended royal feasts, and had legitimate reason to ask probing questions about trade, military strength, and royal succession. His diplomatic pouch was as likely to contain coded intelligence as it was official scrolls. This convergence was most visible at major religious centers. Take the oracle at Delphi in Greece. For centuries, city-states and foreign kings sent lavish gifts and solemn delegations to seek the god Apollo's guidance on matters of war, colonization, and alliance. The pilgrims waiting for their turn did not spend their days in silent prayer. They mingled in the bustling town, trading gossip, boasting of their home city's wealth, and discreetly probing rivals for weakness. Priests and temple officials, privy to the anxieties of every supplicant, held a composite picture of the geopolitical landscape that was arguably more complete than any single king's. A clever intelligence officer posing as a priest or a humble scribe at such a site had access to a continuous stream of unguarded conversation from across the known world. The practical advantages were immense. Religious personnel often enjoyed rites of safe passage, even during times of conflict, and their movements were less scrutinized than those of soldiers or merchants. A traveling monk or a delegation sent to consult a foreign oracle could cross borders with a legitimacy that masked other intentions. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, frequently dispatched church missions to neighboring Slavic and steppe tribes. While the stated goal was conversion or fostering goodwill, these clerics were also keen observers, noting tribal conflicts, resource availability, and military dispositions, information crucial for the empire's frontier defense policy. Similarly, Persian kings were known to send inquiries to famous oracles in Egypt or Anatolia. While they sought divine portents, they also gained insights into the political stability and loyalties of those distant regions through the intermediaries they employed. Even celebrations of peace could serve the quiet needs of espionage. The ancient Olympic Games enforced a sacred truce, halting conflicts so athletes and spectators could travel safely to the festival. This neutral ground became a premier venue for clandestine diplomacy and intelligence exchange. Envoys from warring states could meet without losing face, and agents could mingle with the crowds, gathering news from every corner of the Greek world under the cover of celebrating athletic prowess. It was a space where the sacred rule of the truce protected not just athletes, but the secret conversations that might prevent the next war. This system reveals a profound adaptability. When dedicated spy networks were too risky or politically untenable, ancient states simply co-opted the existing channels of faith and formal dialogue. It meant that the very institutions built for spiritual connection and peaceful negotiation were silently repurposed as the listening posts and relay stations of imperial intelligence. The gods were worshipped, treaties were discussed, and all the while, in the shadows of the colonnades, the silent work of empire carried on. A spy's greatest weapon was not a dagger, but a system. Behind every whispered secret and coded message lay a hidden world of logistics, a silent machinery that made covert action possible. How does an agent stationed in a hostile city receive his instructions, send his findings back home, or even collect his pay without exposing the entire network? The answer lies not in daring heroics, but in the unglamorous, meticulous planning of communication, funding, and shelter. These were the three pillars of operational survival, and ancient empires became masters of their design. First, consider the flow of information. A trusted courier network was vital, but moving a sensitive report required more than a fast runner. Spies relied on pre-arranged dead drop locations, places where a message could be left and retrieved without the agents ever meeting. A loose brick in a city wall, a hollow in a specific tree outside the gates, a niche in a public bathhouse, these anonymous spots became the invisible mailboxes of the ancient world. The Arthashastra details this with clinical precision, advising on how to establish signals to indicate a drop was active or compromised. But what about bulkier intelligence? A sketched map of fortifications or a list of troop numbers couldn't be memorized easily. For this, agents might use trusted merchants as mules, hiding documents within shipments of cloth or pottery, or they employed miniature writing on thin scrolls that could be concealed in a hollow walking staff or sewn into a garment's lining. The physical act of moving knowledge was a constant, calculated risk. Funding this shadow war presented its own puzzle. A spy needed money for bribes, for lodging, for maintaining a convincing cover as a merchant or minor official. But large, traceable transactions from the royal treasury would raise immediate suspicion. Ancient handlers solved this through front businesses and untraceable currency. An agent might be set up as a legitimate trader in spices or textiles, with the state providing the initial capital. His business generated plausible income, funding his operations while also providing excellent cover for travel and contact. Alternatively, financing arrived in the form of smuggled precious metals, gold dust sealed in wax balls that could be swallowed if captured, or unmarked silver ingots that could be melted down and used locally. The Arthashastra goes so far as to outline detailed budgets for different categories of agents, specifying their salaries and expense allowances with the same care as a military payroll. This was espionage as a bureaucratic enterprise, demanding rigorous accounting to prevent graft and ensure resources reached the right hands. Finally, an agent needed a place to operate from, a safe house. These were not secret fortresses, but rather ordinary locations where a spy could blend in, rest, and prepare reports. Sympathetic households of merchants or minor officials loyal to the distant empire provided one option. Inns and taverns, with their constant flow of travelers, offered anonymity. Even brothels, places where patrons came and went without scrutiny, were noted in historical records as common meeting points for exchanging information. Yet any fixed location carried vulnerability. A safe house could be watched, or its owner could be turned by the enemy. The most secure networks therefore relied on mobility, with agents changing lodgings frequently and avoiding predictable patterns. To see this logistical chain in action, follow a single piece of intelligence on its journey. A watchman in a frontier outpost observes unusual troop movements in a neighboring kingdom. He conveys this to a local spice merchant who is actually a ranking intelligence officer. The merchant encodes the message using a simple cipher, rolls the tiny scroll, and seals it in a clay pot meant for a shipment of saffron. The caravan driver, another asset on the payroll, knows to deliver this specific pot to a particular inn in the next major city. There, the innkeeper's wife, a trusted contact, retrieves the scroll and places it in a dead drop, a crack in a well outside the city walls. 2 days later, a traveling monk collects it. He carries it along with other reports across the mountains, using his religious status for safe passage. At the Imperial border, he passes the accumulated intelligence to a military courier of the Cursus Publicus, who races it along the royal road to the capital. Within 3 weeks, a report that began as a glance from a watchtower is in the emperor's hands, informing a crucial diplomatic decision. This entire fragile chain relied on every link holding, on every person knowing their role, and on the mundane logistics of trade routes, hiding places, and sealed pots working perfectly. It reveals the ultimate truth of these networks. Brilliant strategy and psychological manipulation were the brain of the operation, but this quiet, relentless logistics was the beating heart. Empires were held together by these countless, unseen deliveries, by the patient movement of secrets along channels only a handful of people knew existed. She pours the wine, laughs at his jokes, and remembers every word. In the glittering courts of the Hellenistic kings, the most trusted confidant was often not a general or an advisor, but a courtesan. Her power came from intimacy, from the unguarded moments when a ruler, weary of the mask of statecraft, might reveal a secret ambition or a hidden fear. This scene challenges our most basic image of the ancient spy. While manuals like the Arthashastra speak of male agents, the historical and literary record is clear. Women were not just passive bystanders in the world of intelligence, they were active, pivotal players in its silent games. From enslaved ladies in waiting to influential merchants and even ruling queens, women operated within a unique and powerful niche, precisely because they were so often overlooked by the official, male-dominated power structure. Their effectiveness stemmed from a simple, brutal truth of ancient society. They were frequently underestimated. A man might guard his words in the council chamber, but speak freely in the private quarters of his home. A woman serving the meal or arranging the flowers could be considered part of the scenery, an invisible listener to conversations of immense strategic value. This granted women access to the most protected space of all, the domestic sphere, where alliances were brokered in private and true intentions were sometimes revealed. Literary traditions from across the ancient world reflect this understanding. The story of Delilah in the Hebrew Bible, while layered with cultural and moral themes, is fundamentally a tale of intelligence gathering through intimate relationship. Her successful extraction of the secret of Samson's strength, leading to his capture, is a classic narrative of a trusted companion using that access for a political or military end. Centuries later, the Byzantine Empress Theodora, who rose from a theatrical background to co-rule the empire with Justinian, was renowned for her vast network of informants. She cultivated sources at every level of society, using the information they provided to outmaneuver political rivals and solidify her own formidable influence within the palace. This was not mere gossip, it was statecraft conducted through channels her husband could not easily access. We can break down the specific roles women filled within these shadow networks. Many were unparalleled gatherers of social intelligence. In the salons and private parties of Athens or Rome, a skilled hetera, a highly educated companion, could steer conversation and absorb the political leanings and personal vulnerabilities of powerful men. Others served as discreet messengers, their movements between households for social visits providing perfect cover for carrying sealed notes or verbal commands. Then there was the role of the seductress, what modern intelligence would call a honey trap. A woman could be tasked with forming a romantic attachment with a specific target to elicit secrets or exert influence. Perhaps the most significant role, however, was that of the handler or spymistress. A woman of high status, like a queen or a noblewoman, could manage entire networks of agents, using her social connections and resources to direct operations while remaining insulated by her public position. The legendary figure of Phryne, one of the most famous hetairai of 4th century BC Greece, illustrates this blurred line between social influence and covert power. Renowned for her beauty and wit, she moved in the circles of philosophers, orators, and generals. When she was famously put on trial for impiety, her defense attorney simply disrobed her before the judges, who, stunned by her beauty, acquitted her immediately. While this story is often told for its dramatic flair, the underlying truth is profound. Phryne possessed such immense social capital and personal influence over the most powerful men in Athens that the normal rules did not apply to her. It is inconceivable that a woman in such a position, privy to the secrets and scandals of the city's elite, would not have been a source of or a conduit for sensitive information. To ignore the role of women is to see only half of the ancient intelligence machine. It operated not just in the field and the forum, but in the garden, the bedroom, and the banquet hall. By leveraging societal expectations as their ultimate cover, these women turned their perceived invisibility into a formidable asset, proving that sometimes the quietest listener in the room held the fate of empires in her hands. The courtesan who listens, the merchant who carries secrets, the clerk who audits with a hidden purpose, all existed in a world of profound moral twilight. Were these shadowy figures patriots preserving a fragile peace, or were they the oppressive tools of tyranny, weaving a web of fear to hold millions in check? This is not a question with an easy answer, but the very heart of the ethical dilemma that covert intelligence forces upon us, a conflict between the needs of the state and the rights of the individual that echoes through the centuries. To understand it, we must step into two completely different pairs of shoes. From the vantage point of the imperial palace, these networks were not a sinister force, but the essential guardians of civilization. An empire like Rome or Persia was not a monolithic block. It was a delicate ecosystem of diverse cultures, languages, and competing local interests. Without a central nervous system to detect rebellion, corruption, or external invasion, this vast structure could fracture into endless, bloody conflict. The spy who uncovered a governor's plot to secede was not just serving his king, he was preventing a civil war that would devastate entire regions. The agent who provided accurate intelligence on a migrating tribe allowed for diplomatic solutions or targeted defense, sparing frontier towns from indiscriminate violence. In this light, the covert operative was a protector of the Pax Romana or the Persian peace, the stability that allowed trade to flourish, laws to be administered, and ideas to travel safely across continents. The greater good of maintained order justified the lesser evils of deception and secrecy. Ancient philosophers grappled with this tension. Plato, in crafting his ideal republic, introduced the concept of the noble lie, a myth told by the guardians of the state to promote social harmony and loyalty. While not a direct endorsement of espionage, it reflects an ancient acknowledgement that rulers might need to use fiction and concealment to steward a complex society. Centuries later, Machiavelli would argue more bluntly that the survival of the state could necessitate actions deemed immoral in private life, an idea known as raison d'etat or reason of state. The empire's perspective was fundamentally utilitarian. The well-being of the whole justified the morally ambiguous means, but we must also see through the eyes of the provincial farmer, the local artisan, or the minor official. To them, the agent of the secret network was not a guardian, but an instrument of fear and control. The Frumentarii of Rome were deeply hated by the common people and the aristocracy alike, viewed not as protectors but as predatory informers and the emperor's private thugs. Their power to audit, interrogate, and detain based on suspicion alone created a society where a careless comment to a neighbor could lead to ruin. This was not security, it was psychological oppression. For subjugated peoples, these networks were tools of cultural suppression, identifying and eliminating local leaders who resisted assimilation, ensuring their traditions and languages faded under the watchful eyes of imperial agents. Personal morality of the individual spy compounds this ambiguity. Many were motivated by genuine loyalty or belief in their empire's civilizing mission. Others were simply desperate, recruited from the ranks of the bankrupt or the disgraced, their moral compass bent by hardship or ambition. They lived with the daily corrosion of betraying trust, of fostering friendships they were duty-bound to destroy. The societal cost of such pervasive, invisible surveillance was a subtle erosion of community, replacing open discourse with whispered suspicion, turning citizens into potential informants against one another. Consider the Roman historian Tacitus, who chronicled the reign of emperors like Domitian. He writes of a Rome where the presence of the Frumentarii made every dinner party a potential source of accusation, where families feared their own slaves might be reporting private conversations. The security apparatus meant to defend the state began to poison the social fabric it was supposed to protect. This is the timeless and perhaps unsolvable paradox. The very mechanisms that could prevent large-scale suffering through stability were also mechanisms that inflicted a quieter, more diffuse suffering through the loss of liberty and trust. It asks us where the line is, or if a line can even be drawn, between necessary vigilance and oppressive control. As we look at the silent architects who held empires together, we are ultimately looking in a mirror, confronting a dilemma that every society grappling with security and freedom must face anew. A frontier fort sleeps under a moonless sky, its guards lulled by years of quiet. No warning comes. At dawn, the horizon darkens with the banners of a rival empire, an army materializing where scouts had reported only empty plains. This was not merely a military defeat, it was the sound of a silent system snapping. The intricate networks of spies, inspectors, and couriers that held empires together were not invincible. Their greatest test came not in their success but in their failure. And when these hidden systems broke down, the consequences were often catastrophic. The health of an intelligence network was a direct bellwether for the health of the empire itself. A robust, well-funded service suggested a vigilant, capable state. A corrupted, degraded, or blindfolded network was a symptom of a deeper sickness, one that could leave the entire realm vulnerable to a single, devastating surprise. Historians of the Roman Empire's later centuries point to a telling decay in its once formidable apparatus. The agents in rebus, the agents of affairs who managed the imperial post and internal security, became increasingly entangled in the bureaucratic corruption and patronage politics that plagued the late Roman state. Instead of impartial observers, they became positions to be bought and sold, their loyalties shifting to wealthy patrons rather than the distant emperor. The flow of accurate information, the empire's lifeblood, began to clot with lies and omissions. We can trace several critical failure modes that doomed these systems. The first was internal corruption, where the spies themselves became the problem. When agents were more interested in extorting bribes from the populace they were meant to monitor, or selling their reports to the highest bidder, the intelligence reaching the capital was not just useless, it was dangerously misleading. A governor planning rebellion could simply purchase the silence or favorable report of the imperial inspector sent to watch him. Another fatal error was over-reliance on a single source or channel. If all intelligence on a northern frontier came from a few allied chieftains, and those chieftains decided to switch their allegiance, the empire could be struck blind overnight. This was not theoretical. In the late 4th century, the Roman frontier along the Danube suffered a catastrophic breach by Gothic tribes. Historical analysis suggests Roman reconnaissance had grown lax, relying too heavily on outdated treaties and the reports of intermediaries who themselves were under new pressures. The massive Gothic migration and the subsequent Roman defeat at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 revealed a profound intelligence failure, where a major threat was not understood until it was literally at the gates. Perhaps the most subtle failure was analytical. It is one thing to gather information, another to understand what it means. A court drowning in conflicting reports from its provinces might fail to distinguish vital truth from background noise. Pride and preconception could also cloud judgment. An emperor convinced of his own invincibility might dismiss accurate warnings of a new enemy as the exaggerations of fearful border commanders. This leads to the physical severing of the network itself. Invasions by nomadic confederations or rival empires often deliberately targeted the infrastructure of control. Relay stations of the Persian or Roman postal systems were prime targets for destruction, cutting the swift lines of communication that allowed for rapid response. Once these lines were cut, provinces were isolated, and the central government was left groping in the dark, unable to coordinate defense or even know which territories had already fallen. A stunning example of cascading intelligence failure is the rapid Arab conquests of the 7th century. The Byzantine and Sasanian Persian empires, exhausted from decades of brutal war against each other, had largely degraded their intelligence gathering on the Arabian Peninsula. They viewed the desert tribes as a minor, fragmented concern. They failed to analyze the unifying force of a new faith and the formidable leadership it produced. When the Arab armies emerged, they moved with a speed and coordination that neither empire was prepared to comprehend. Key border fortresses fell before word could even reach the capitals, and the old empires found their intricate systems of control utterly useless against a new kind of threat they had never truly seen coming. The collapse of these networks was never just about bad spies. It was about crumbling institutions, lost trust, and the arrogance that comes from long-held power. It reminds us that the silent threads of information are as fragile as they are strong, and when they fray, the entire tapestry can unravel with terrifying speed. The Silent War was fought differently in the halls of Persepolis, the forums of Rome, and the courts of Pataliputra. While every ancient empire recognized the need for covert knowledge, the methods they chose reflected the very soul of their civilization, a fascinating divergence between East and West in how to master the art of the unseen. To understand this, we can place three iconic systems side by side. Persia perfected the model of the centralized inspector, the king's eyes and ears, a top-down system where loyalty to the monarch was the supreme virtue and oversight flowed from the center outward. Rome, in contrast, developed a pragmatic, militarized apparatus. The Frumentarii emerged from the legion's supply corps, a solution born from logistical necessity that evolved into a tool for political enforcement. Their power was direct, often brutal, and deeply integrated into the machinery of the state. Then, far to the east, Mauryan India produced the Arthashastra, a system that was not just practical but profoundly philosophical and hyper-codified. It treated espionage as a science of human nature, with detailed taxonomies of agent types and psychological strategies for recruitment. This was intelligence as a branch of statecraft philosophy, meticulously planned and theoretically comprehensive. These differences were not accidental. They grew directly from each empire's cultural and governmental structures. The Persian model mirrored its imperial ideology, a great king ruling diverse subjects through a clear hierarchical chain of command. The Roman system reflected its legalistic, militaristic culture, repurposing existing institutions for new needs. The Arthashastra mirrored the intricate, systematized thinking found in other Indian sciences, from medicine to statecraft. We can see this clearly in the primary sources they left behind. The Arthashastra is a detailed technical manual, reading almost like a Spycraft textbook. Roman accounts from historians like Tacitus or Suetonius are more anecdotal and embedded within narratives of political history, often highlighting the fear and scandal the intelligence agents caused. One system was prescriptive, the other descriptive. Drawing a narrative comparison, we can observe a broad pattern. Eastern empires, particularly as seen in India and to a degree in China, often emphasized preventative internal surveillance. The goal was to maintain harmony and order within a vast, complex society by identifying dissent before it could flower. This led to complex agent categorization, with specific spies assigned to monitor specific societal strata, from ministers to merchants. Western empires, with Rome as the prime example, often focused more acutely on external military intelligence and internal political enforcement. Their networks were tools for frontier defense and for controlling the ambitions of provincial governors and rival politicians. The Roman preoccupation was often on the immediate threat, the rebel army or the plotting senator, rather than the perpetual societal monitoring envisioned in the Arthashastra. Even their use of technology and auxiliary methods showed variance. While both employed cryptography, the Roman shift cipher was elegantly simple for battlefield use, whereas Indian texts contemplated more complex substitution ciphers. The role of religion also diverged. In the Greco-Roman world, oracles and temples became neutral grounds for intelligence gathering, co-opting existing institutions. In the Eastern contexts described in the Arthashastra, religion could be a tool, with spies disguised as wandering ascetics, but the system itself was secular and administrative, a function of the state rather than a Chinese letter of spiritual authority. Consider the parallel figures of the Persian king's eye and the Roman Frumentarius. Both served a similar core function. They were the central authority's means of overseeing distant territories. But their institutional origins shaped their perception. The king's eye was a high-ranking noble, his authority explicit and tied to his royal status. The Frumentarius was a former quartermaster, his power derived from the emperor's mandate but operating from within the army's logistical wing. Culturally, the king's eye was a respected, if feared, official. The Frumentarius was widely despised as an informer and enforcer. This contrast is telling. One system created an inspectorate, the other created a secret police. This synthesis reveals that there was no single ancient blueprint for spycraft. Instead, empires developed unique solutions to a universal problem, their methods a mirror reflecting their deepest values, fears, and structures of power. The East often sought to weave surveillance into the fabric of society itself, while the West frequently built it into the backbone of military and political control. Both understood that to hold a world together, you first had to learn how to see it completely, and their differing visions of that perfect sight continue to inform our understanding of power to this day. The emperor's war room is not in Rome but in Constantinople, and the man before him is not a Frumentarius, but the Logothetes II Dramu, the minister of the post and the state's security. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's direct successor, did not abandon the silent tools of power, it refined them. This is the crucial legacy of ancient networks. A direct lineage of knowledge that survived the fall of classical empires was preserved, studied, and evolved, creating a continuous thread from Persia and Rome to the Renaissance and beyond. The Byzantines inherited Rome's bureaucratic genius and made it more subtle. The Logothetes controlled the vast imperial post, the dromos, which was far more than a mail service. it was the empire's information circulatory system. His agents, often traveling as merchants or monks, reported on everything from barbarian movements on the Danube to the loyalty of generals in Anatolia. This was a professionalized, permanent intelligence ministry, a clear evolution from the ad hoc systems of the past. Their military manual, the Strategikon, attributed to Emperor Maurus in the 6th century, dedicates entire chapters to the use of scouts and spies, advising commanders to use deceptive tactics and to always verify the reports they receive through multiple sources. This was ancient wisdom codified and passed down. This knowledge did not stay within Byzantine walls. Through conflict and cultural exchange, Byzantine practices deeply influenced the intelligence systems of their great rivals and successors. The Arab caliphates and later the Ottoman Empire adopted and adapted these models. Ottoman sultans developed an elaborate network of couriers and informants, and their famed Janissary Corps included elements for internal security, echoing the Roman blend of military and intelligence functions. The intellectual thread was equally strong. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars in Baghdad and Damascus studied Greek, Persian, and Indian texts. The Arab polymath al-Kindi in the 9th century wrote a groundbreaking manuscript on cryptanalysis, literally titled, "A Manuscript on Deciphering Cryptographic Messages." He built upon ancient cryptographic traditions but introduced the brilliant method of frequency analysis, systematically counting how often letters appeared to crack substitution ciphers. This was not a rejection of the past, but a sophisticated evolution of it, turning an art into a more rigorous science. Centuries later, this preserved knowledge would flow back into a reawakening Europe. During the Renaissance, classical texts were rediscovered and translated, including works by historians who detailed Persian and Roman methods, and philosophical tracts that contemplated statecraft. This rediscovery found its most famous and infamous student in Niccolò Machiavelli. In The Prince and his Discourses, Machiavelli analyzed Roman history with a cold, practical eye. His advice to a ruler that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, and his discussions on the use of deceit in statecraft, were deeply informed by his reading of ancient precedents. He was not inventing a new dark art, he was articulating the timeless principles that had silently governed empires, now framed for the competitive city-states of Italy. One of those city-states, the Venetian Republic, operated what was arguably the most sophisticated intelligence network of the late medieval and early modern period. Their Council of 10 maintained a vast web of ambassadors, merchants, and spies across the Mediterranean and Europe. Venetian agents used complex codes, invisible inks, and a centralized filing system for reports that rivals modern databases. Their entire system, focused on protecting commercial and political interests, was a direct echo of Roman pragmatism applied to the mercantile world. An illustrative example bridges these worlds. Consider a sealed letter from a Venetian ambassador in Constantinople, warning of an Ottoman fleet movement. The letter is written in a complex cipher, a direct descendant of the Caesar shift, refined by Arab mathematical analysis. It travels via fast galley and horseback, a logistical chain perfected by the Byzantine dromos and the Persian royal road before it. When it reaches the Doge's palace, the contents are analyzed by counselors who think like Machiavelli, weighing deception and response. The principles at work, secure communication, rapid transit, strategic analysis, and covert human sources, are all fundamentally the same ones that allowed an emperor in Persepolis to check a distant satrap. This is the profound durability of these ancient systems. The technology changed from papyrus to cipher wheels, and the players shifted from kings to merchant princes, but the core blueprint for building and maintaining power through controlled information remained stubbornly, powerfully intact. The silent architects of antiquity had drawn a map for statecraft that the world would follow for millennia, a map written not in borders but in secrets. A broken clay tablet lies in the dust, its surface covered in the tiny, wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script. For decades, it was catalogued simply as a merchant's receipt for a shipment of barley. But under the careful examination of a scholar like Irving Finkel of the British Museum, the mundane gives way to the mysterious. The quantities are strangely precise, the destinations unusually specific. Could this be more than an invoice? Could it be a coded report, a ledger of supplies meant for a network of informants rather than a storehouse? This is the fundamental challenge of studying ancient intelligence. We are piecing together a shadow from fragments, learning to read between the lines of history itself. How can we possibly know about activities designed to leave no trace? The answer lies in a meticulous synthesis of evidence, where a tax record, a line of poetry, and a discarded writing tablet can, together, reveal the outlines of a silent war. Historians rely on three broad, interlocking categories of proof. The first is direct textual evidence, the manuals and administrative documents that explicitly discuss spycraft. The Arthashastra is the prime example, a direct instruction manual for running a state that dedicates entire books to the recruitment, payment, and deployment of agents. It is not a story, it is a textbook. Similarly, law codes from cultures like the Hittites or Assyrians contain clauses about the treatment of captured spies, proving their existence was a recognized fact of interstate relations. The second category is indirect literary evidence. This includes the works of historians like Herodotus, who describes the Persian Eyes and Ears, or Tacitus, who details the feared actions of the Roman Frumentarii. While these accounts can be biased or embellished, their consistent mention of such figures across different authors and centuries points to a widespread institutional reality. The third, and often most telling, category is archaeological evidence. These are the physical objects that hint at the daily mechanics of secrecy. Take the Vindolanda tablets, a stunning collection of thin, postcard-sized wooden writing tablets found at a Roman fort in northern Britain. They preserve the mundane correspondence of soldiers and their families, requests for socks, birthday party invitations, but among them are military reports noting the strange movements of local British tribes, descriptions of their numbers and morale. These are not grand histories, they are field intelligence, the raw data sent up the chain of command, offering a breathtakingly immediate glimpse into the Roman army's constant, watchful presence on the frontier. Another powerful example comes from the decoding of Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean Greek palaces around 1200 BCE. When Michael Ventris deciphered it in the 1950s, the tablets did not reveal epic poetry or royal decrees. They revealed inventories, lists of chariot wheels, allocations of bronze, and records of personnel. This proved the Mycenaean palaces were not just warrior strongholds but centralized, bureaucratic economies that monitored resources and people with meticulous detail, the foundational infrastructure necessary for any kind of systematic internal oversight. The interpretation of this evidence is a delicate art. A single source is never enough. A line in a play about a clever courtesan spy must be weighed against a royal edict about border scouts. The key is convergence, when multiple, independent lines of evidence point to the same conclusion. For instance, the Arthashastra describes spies using hollow staffs to carry messages. Then, archaeologists in the Middle East uncover ceremonial rods from the same period with precisely crafted secret compartments. The literary trope meets a physical object, and a plausible practice emerges from the shadows. The greatest challenge is separating practical reality from political propaganda or literary flourish. When a Roman historian claims an emperor used his agents to eliminate a rival, is it a factual report or a smear crafted by a senatorial critic? The historian must look for corroboration in coinage, in the speed of military response, in the patterns of succession. It requires reading the silence as well as the text, asking what administrative capability must have existed for certain events to have transpired as they did. This forensic work validates the entire narrative. We know these networks existed not because of one smoking gun, but because of 1,000 scattered clues that only make sense when assembled into a coherent picture. The barley receipt, the birthday letter from a frontier fort, the paranoid lines of a historian, and the cold prescriptions of a statecraft manual, they are all echoes of the same silent conversation. They remind us that history is not just the story of what was said aloud, but often the story of what was meant to be hidden, waiting centuries for a curious mind to learn its language. The Trojan horse stands not just outside the gates of Troy, but at the crossroads of myth and intelligence. A giant wooden statue, hollowed out to hide elite soldiers, is the ultimate act of strategic deception. Yet for all its cinematic thrill, the story from Homer's epic raises a profound question for historians. Is this a tale of ancient espionage or pure mythological invention? The answer, fascinatingly, lies somewhere in between. These legendary narratives are not factual reports, but they are invaluable reflections. They reveal how ancient cultures themselves understood the power of secrecy, cunning, and information, crystallizing real practices into archetypal stories that resonated across generations. To separate the spy fiction from the spy fact, we must listen to what these myths are trying to tell us about the world that created them. Experts in classical literature note that the Homeric epics and biblical accounts, while not history books, are packed with episodes of trickery and intelligence gathering that would have felt familiar to their audiences. The stories mirror the tactical realities of their time, even as they elevate them to the level of legend. We can see this clearly in direct comparisons. The Arthashastra coldly lists the ideal traits of an agent, including eloquence, courage, and the ability to withstand hardship. Now consider the legendary Greek hero Odysseus, the man of many turns. His entire story in the Trojan War and his long voyage home is a saga of cunning over brute force. He invents the Trojan horse. He disguises himself as a beggar to infiltrate his own palace. He outwits monsters with clever lies. Odysseus is not a documented spy, but he embodies the exact archetype of the perfect operative that a manual like the Arthashastra would describe. He is the trickster hero, a cultural personification of intelligence itself. Similarly, the biblical book of Joshua recounts the story of Rahab, a woman in the city of Jericho who hides 2 Israelite spies sent to scout the city's defenses. She lowers them from her window on a scarlet cord to escape, and in return, she and her family are spared when the city falls. This is a powerful narrative of faith and covenant. But it also perfectly illustrates a documented historical practice, the use of a safe house operated by a sympathetic local. Rahab's home functions exactly as the inns or merchant houses described in earlier sections, a secure location for agents to gather intelligence and evade capture. The story takes a covert tactic and weaves it into a foundational myth of divine promise, showing how espionage could be framed within a culture's moral and spiritual worldview. This leads us to a crucial subpoint. Why did ancient societies feel the need to mythologize spies and deceivers? These figures often become cultural heroes because they represent intellect triumphing over overwhelming force. They are the underdogs who use their wits to change the fate of nations, a deeply appealing narrative. The spy or trickster, whether Odysseus in Greece or the clever animal spirits in many global folktales, operates in a moral gray area that both fascinates and instructs. They show that rules can be bent, that appearances can deceive, and that knowledge is the ultimate equalizer. These stories served as both entertainment and informal education, passing down lessons about strategy, social cunning, and the precarious nature of trust. A masterful illustrative example of this blend comes from Chinese legend and later historical chronicles, the empty fort strategy. The tale is set in the turbulent Three Kingdoms period and is associated with the strategist Zhuge Liang. Faced with an approaching enemy army and possessing only a handful of troops to defend a vulnerable city, Zhuge Liang does not bar the gates or flee. Instead, he orders the gates thrown wide open. He sits atop the city wall, calmly playing a lute, while a few old soldiers are seen casually sweeping the streets. The enemy general, arriving at this scene of utter tranquility, is immediately suspicious. He concludes that such visible calm must be an obvious trap, a ruse to lure him into an ambush. Fearing hidden legions, he orders a full retreat. This story is a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a deception based entirely on manipulating the enemy's own expectations and fear. While the specific event may be embellished, the principle it demonstrates, using perception and misinformation as a weapon, is a cornerstone of a tested military intelligence practice across cultures. From the disinformation campaigns of Sun Tzu to the feigned retreats of nomadic steppe armies, the empty fort strategy is a legendary encapsulation of a very real tactical truth. So, where does this leave our understanding? The Trojan horse may never have physically existed, but the concept it represents, the audacious, deceptive stroke that ends a decade-long stalemate, was a constant aspiration of ancient generals and spies. These myths are the cultural echo of the Silent War. They take the shadowy, often morally ambiguous work of the agent and transform it into epic poetry, sacred text, and legendary stratagem. They prove that long before the modern spy thriller, the ancient world was already captivated by the high-stakes drama of secrets and lies, understanding instinctively that the most compelling stories were often the ones hidden in plain sight. The most valuable cargo in the world was not gold, but a worm. In the hushed chambers of the Byzantine court in the 6th century, Emperor Justinian received 2 monks who had journeyed to the distant lands of the seers, the Silk people. Their mission, cloaked in piety, was one of supreme economic espionage. They were to steal the secret that had granted China a monopoly on wealth for centuries, the method of producing silk itself. This was not a quest for military maps, but for a biological blueprint. The monks succeeded, famously smuggling silkworm eggs out of China, hidden within hollow bamboo staves, a theft that would break an economic stranglehold and reshape the Mediterranean economy. It reveals a driving force behind ancient intelligence often overshadowed by tales of war and politics, the relentless pursuit of profit and technological advantage. Economic historians note that the control of certain commodities was a form of power as decisive as any army. Silk was more than a fabric, it was a geopolitical instrument. The vibrant purple dye extracted from murex snails, so costly it became synonymous with royalty, was a state secret of Phoenician cities. The method for making the famed Wootz steel of India, known for its legendary strength and watery pattern, was sought after from Rome to Damascus. The recipe for Roman concrete, which could set underwater, was a marvel that competitors desperately wished to replicate. These were the crown jewels of ancient economies, and spies were their most determined thieves. The silk case is the most famous, but the pattern was widespread. For centuries, China guarded the secrets of sericulture with extreme vigilance, imposing the death penalty on anyone caught attempting to export silkworms or eggs. The Byzantine success was a monumental intelligence coup, allowing them to establish their own silk industry and stem the catastrophic flow of gold and silver eastward. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder lamented this drain in his Natural History, estimating that vast sums, perhaps 100 million sesterces annually, flowed to the east for silk and other luxuries, a trade deficit that weakened the empire's financial core. His frustration was a direct admission of economic vulnerability, a clear motive for espionage. Parallel efforts targeted other technologies. There are strong indications that the techniques for producing high-quality steel, often called ceramic iron when it came from India, were the subject of intense industrial espionage along trade routes. While the exact methods of transfer are lost to secrecy, the eventual mastery of Damascus steel by Islamic metalsmiths and the later development of similar patterned steels in Europe suggest a slow, deliberate seepage of knowledge, likely aided by the movement of skilled artisans who were sometimes bribed, kidnapped, or incentivized to defect. States understood that artisans were living repositories of secret knowledge. Many empires imposed strict controls, forbidding skilled workers from emigrating. In some cases, communities of glassblowers or armorers were effectively placed under house arrest in special quarters to prevent their expertise from being sold to a rival. The trade routes, especially the Silk Road, were the perfect vectors for this covert transfer. A merchant caravan carried more than spices. It carried the subtle, unspoken knowledge of the craftsman who made the goods, the metallurgist who refined the ore, or the agriculturalist who cultivated a rare plant. A spy posing as a merchant could learn not just political gossip, but observe a new loom design, a furnace technique, or a dyeing process. He could befriend or bribe a disgruntled apprentice with knowledge to sell. This form of intelligence had a clear, tangible return on investment. While a political spy might prevent a war, an economic spy could fill the royal treasury, equip legions with superior swords, or clothe an elite in status symbols that projected power. The theft of the silkworm was not an act of war, but it was an act of economic warfare with consequences that lasted for generations. It reminds us that the silent architects of empire were not only watching for rebels and invaders, they were also peering into workshops and fields, understanding that the true strength of a civilization often lay not in its armies, but in its secrets of silk and steel. A strip of parchment over 20 feet long unfolds, not to reveal a realistic landscape, but a vibrant, schematic snake of roads connecting cities from Britain to India. This is the Tabula Peutingeriana, a medieval copy of a Roman map, and it is less a picture of the world than a diagram of control. Its purpose was not to show mountains and rivers in perfect proportion, but to chart the empire's logistical nervous system, the distances between way stations, the location of baths, and the branching paths of military supply. This artifact captures a profound truth for ancient empires. Geography was not a neutral science. It was the ultimate intelligence product. To govern and defend a vast territory, you first had to transform the unknown into a known, a landscape of threats and opportunities laid out on a scroll. The silent networks did not just gather secrets about people and plots, they systematically harvested the secrets of the earth itself. The journeys of explorers were, in essence, long-range intelligence missions. Centuries before the tabula, a Greek named Pythias of Massalia sailed from the Mediterranean into the foggy, uncharted waters of the North Atlantic. His written account, now lost but quoted by later geographers, described the amber coasts, the midnight sun, and a land he called Thule. To his contemporaries, it sounded like fantasy, but for any state with commercial or military interests, Pythias' voyage was a priceless report on the resources and routes beyond the known world. Similarly, the detailed Chinese chronicles of the western regions, compiled from the travels of envoys like Zhang Qian and the monks who followed, were meticulous geopolitical surveys. They recorded not just the customs of distant peoples, but the distances between oases, the locations of mountain passes, and the strength of local kingdoms, intelligence critical for managing the Silk Road and securing a turbulent frontier. This raw data from merchants, scouts, and captive travelers was synthesized into practical tools for power. The Romans perfected the itinerarium, a list of roads and stopping points with precise distances measured in paces. A commander marching to a new province would not consult a painted landscape. He would follow this functional text, knowing exactly where his legions could find water, forage, and a secure camp each night. This transformed movement from a gamble into a calculated operation. Beyond roads, the identification of strategic choke points was paramount. Intelligence agents focused on places where geography amplified power, a narrow mountain pass like the Cilician Gates in Anatolia, a fordable point on a great river like the Rhine, or a desert oasis that controlled a caravan route. Controlling these points meant you could tax commerce, halt an invading army, or sever the communication lines of a rebellion with a minimal force. Resource mapping was equally vital. Reports from scouts and local informants would detail the locations of mines for silver, copper, or iron, the forests suitable for shipbuilding timber, and the agricultural regions that could feed a garrison. A Roman governor receiving such a report was not just learning about the land, he was reading a balance sheet of his province's strategic value. We can see this process in the fragments of writing from the very edge of empire. The Vindolanda tablets, those personal letters from a remote British fort, also contain military dispatches that are masterpieces of tactical geography. A scout's report might describe the path through a specific marsh, note which hilltops offered clear vantage, or estimate how many days' march a local tribe was from the wall. This was intelligence stripped to its essentials, turning the wild, unfamiliar terrain of Britain into a navigable grid of risks and advantages. This relentless project of mapping was a foundational act of domination. It replaced the mystery of terra incognita with the order of a managed space. By knowing the precise distance from Rome to Antioch, or the exact location of a Persian grain depot, an empire could project force with terrifying efficiency and administer its domains with a bureaucrat's precision. The map, in its many forms, was the ultimate crystallization of covert knowledge, a silent declaration that the world, in all its complexity, could be measured, recorded, and ultimately owned. Whispers can be more destructive than siege engines. In a city surrounded by enemy forces, hope is the final, thin wall holding back despair. Then, a rumor begins to circulate, passed from a frightened merchant to a weary soldier on the rampart. They say the Great Relief Army marching to save them has been ambushed and utterly destroyed. There will be no rescue. Panic spreads like a fever, and the will to resist crumbles from within. This rumor was not an accident. It was a carefully planted weapon, disseminated by agents who had infiltrated the city's gates not with weapons but with words. This reveals a darker, more aggressive function of ancient intelligence networks, psychological warfare. Beyond gathering secrets, these silent architects were masters of manufacturing them, weaponizing information to break an enemy's spirit long before the first physical blow was struck. The great strategist Sun Tzu articulated this principle with chilling clarity. The supreme art of war, he wrote, is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Psychological operations, what we might call PSYOP today, were a deliberate and calculated means to achieve that very end. The goal was not just to know the enemy's mind, but to actively reshape it, to turn confidence into doubt, unity into discord, and courage into fear. The tactics employed were as varied as they were ingenious. One of the most potent involved the manipulation of faith and superstition. Agents would spread false prophecies or ominous signs, claiming that the gods had abandoned the defending city or favored the attacking force. A forged letter, seemingly from a trusted general or ally, could be delivered to enemy commanders, suggesting betrayal within their own ranks and paralyzing their decision-making. Within a besieged population or a military camp, spies would circulate demoralizing gossip, exaggerating the strength of the opposing force or inventing stories of their own side's inevitable defeat. These were attacks on morale designed to erode the collective will to continue the fight. Public displays were another powerful tool. An army might stage a deceptive show of strength, marching the same troops in a loop to appear a vastly larger force from a distance, or lighting countless campfires on a ridge at night to suggest an immense host waiting for dawn. These spectacles were intelligence-driven theater, meant to be observed and reported, their psychological impact carefully calculated. This darker dimension also included the use of fear as a blunt instrument. The public execution of captured spies or rebels was not merely a punishment, it was a performance. It served as a terrifying advertisement of the state's reach and ruthlessness, a stark warning to any who might consider dissent or betrayal. While such methods represented a severe application of state power, they were understood as tools to consolidate control and deter external threats through a demonstration of resolve. A legendary example of psychological mastery comes from Alexander the Great on the eve of his decisive clash with the Persian king Darius III at Gaugamela. Alexander's forces were significantly outnumbered. On the night before the battle, according to the historian Plutarch, Darius could see the countless campfires of the Macedonian army spread across the plain and hear the unsettling noise of their preparations, a deliberate show of confidence. But Alexander was also conducting a brilliant deception. He had ordered his troops to move with unusual noise and light, creating the illusion of a restless, immense force readying for a night attack. This played on the fears of the Persian army, keeping them awake and anxious throughout the night, draining their energy and resolve before the actual battle even began. By the time the sun rose, the Persian soldiers were already fatigued and psychologically unbalanced, while Alexander's rested troops advanced with disciplined focus. The victory at Gaugamela was secured not just by tactical genius on the field, but by a psychological campaign waged in the darkness hours before. These mind games force us to expand our understanding of ancient conflict. The Silent War was not a separate prelude to the clash of armies. It was the opening and often the decisive phase of the battle itself. It was fought in the rumors of the marketplace, the forged letters in a commander's tent, and the ominous glow of distant campfires. To control the narrative was to shape reality, to make an enemy see defeat in the mirror of their own fear long before it ever appeared on the horizon. The emperor stares at 3 scrolls on his desk, each bearing the seal of a different agent, each telling a completely different story about the same rebellion. One claims the uprising is a minor riot, another insists it is a full-scale revolt, and a third warns of a foreign power secretly arming the rebels. In this moment, the silent web of information does not bring clarity but chaos. For all their sophistication, the covert networks of the ancient world operated under a heavy, perpetual fog. They were systems built by humans for humans, and thus were vulnerable to every flaw and limitation of the pre-modern world. Military theorists like Karl von Clausewitz would later coin the term the fog of war to describe the uncertainty that blankets every conflict, but the concept is timeless. Ancient intelligence, despite its marvels, was constantly battling against friction, falsehood, and the sheer, slow passage of time. The first and most formidable wall was time itself. Even on the famed Royal Road, a message from the frontier to the capital took days or weeks. An agent's report on a gathering army was a snapshot of a situation that could have completely transformed by the time the warning arrived. Decisions in the palace were often based on news that was already old, turning strategy into a gamble on outdated information. Then came the problem of the source. How could a king in Persepolis know if the eye he sent to Egypt was still loyal, or if he had been bribed to send back comforting lies? The very nature of espionage made verification nearly impossible. A spy's survival depended on deception, a skill he could just as easily turn against his own masters. Double agents were not just a threat, they were an occupational hazard that could poison an entire network with misinformation. Human error compounded these issues. A tired scout might misjudge the size of an enemy camp. a translator might subtly distort the meaning of a captured document. A scribe copying a coded message by lamplight could transpose two critical letters, rendering the entire report nonsense. Without satellites or instant communication, there was no way to quickly double-check a fact from 1,000 miles away. Analysis was another profound challenge. Imagine a Roman emperor's court inundated with scrolls from a dozen provinces, each filled with rumors, economic data, troop counts, and gossip about local governors. There were no databases, no algorithms to cross-reference. Trusted advisors had to sift this mountain of raw data using intuition and experience, trying to separate vital truth from trivial noise, a task vulnerable to personal bias and political intrigue. The physical world itself conspired against these networks. A spring flood could wash out a crucial bridge on the Imperial post road, delaying all messages for weeks. A band of raiders could ambush a courier in a mountain pass, severing a critical link. An outbreak of illness could incapacitate an entire relay station, creating a dead zone in the Empire's nervous system. These were not mere inconveniences, they were vulnerabilities that enemies learned to exploit. A stark example of these limitations converging is the Roman disaster in the Teutoburg forest. In the year 9, 3 legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus marched into the dense, unfamiliar woodlands of Germania. They relied on intelligence from Arminius, a Germanic chieftain serving as a Roman auxiliary officer. Arminius, however, was secretly organizing a revolt. He provided Varus with deliberately false information, luring the legions into a narrow, marshy trail perfectly suited for an ambush. The Roman scouts, operating in difficult terrain they did not understand, failed to detect the gathering Germanic forces. Communication lines were stretched and then severed. The result was a 3-day massacre that annihilated over 15,000 soldiers and ended Roman expansion east of the Rhine. It was a catastrophic intelligence failure born of misplaced trust, environmental ignorance, and masterful enemy deception. Acknowledging these profound flaws does not diminish the achievements of ancient networks. Instead, it makes their successes all the more remarkable. They achieved what they did not through omniscience, but through relentless effort operating against a tide of uncertainty. They built systems to manage the unmanageable, to bring a little light into the fog, understanding that even flawed knowledge was infinitely better than none at all. A captured spy faced a world without mercy. Ancient law codes from Babylon to Rome are brutally clear on this point. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest written legal systems, implies severe consequences for those who would undermine the king's authority. In Rome, the fate of an enemy agent was unequivocal. The Latin term pedulio covered crimes against the state, and espionage fell squarely within its scope. The prescribed penalty was death, often public and designed to serve as a grim warning. A spy would not be treated as a prisoner of war with the possibility of ransom or exchange. He was a criminal who had operated outside the accepted rules of conflict, and his end was meant to be seen. For the individuals who chose or were forced into this shadow profession, the systemic analysis of networks fades against a stark personal reality. This was a life of extreme danger with virtually no promise of glory. We can trace a few possible life paths, each more common than the last. The rarest was the spy who succeeded and retired wealthy. A handful of ancient accounts mention agents rewarded with land or a comfortable sinecure, but these are the celebrated exceptions, the stories worth recording. Far more common was the agent who simply disappeared. A merchant traveling a dangerous road fails to arrive. A servant in a foreign court falls ill and is never seen again. These vanishings left no record, just a silent break in a chain of information. Then there were those made into public examples. Their stories were recorded not for their heroism, but for the spectacle of their punishment, a lesson etched in public memory. Beyond the physical risk was a profound psychological burden. A spy lived in perpetual isolation, even in a crowded room. He cultivated friendships he was duty-bound to betray, listened to the heartfelt confidences of those he was systematically undermining. Every affectionate gesture, every moment of genuine connection was potentially a weapon or a source of corrosive guilt. There was no official recognition, no medal to wear in the sunlight. His victories were state secrets and his failures were catastrophes. His name, if it survived at all, was more likely to appear on an execution list than a monument. Consider the cryptic case surrounding the Catiline conspiracy in the late Roman Republic. The orator Cicero, as consul, claimed to have been saved by information from spies within the conspirators' ranks. One figure mentioned is a woman named Fulvia, who allegedly passed warnings from her lover, a conspirator. Another is the unnamed informant Cicero alludes to in his speeches. Their reward was ambiguous at best. They may have received financial payment, but their lives were undoubtedly left in greater peril, marked forever as betrayers to a vengeful faction. They became ghosts in Cicero's triumphant narrative, essential yet erased. This is the poignant counterweight to our study of grand systems. For every efficient network and brilliant cipher, there was a person living with fear as a constant companion, bearing the weight of secrets that could shatter lives, including their own. Their sacrifices are the unmarked foundation stones upon which the stability of empires quietly rested, a reminder that history's most powerful gears were turned by invisible and often broken hands. A diplomatic cable is leaked, sparking an international scandal and toppling a government. This headline is not from last week, but from a clay tablet written 3,000 years ago, detailing how a Hittite king's secret treaty was exposed by a bribed scribe. The tools have changed, but the game remains eerily the same. The silent architects of antiquity did not just build networks for their time, they drafted a blueprint for power that is still in use today. By understanding their methods, we gain a powerful lens through which to view our own world of cyber espionage, surveillance, and geopolitical intrigue. As the military historian John Keegan noted, while technology revolutionizes warfare, the human dimension of conflict, including intelligence, remains stubbornly constant. The core principles they established are timeless: the need for trusted human sources, the imperative of secure communication, the strategic use of deception, and the enduring ethical dilemmas that shadow every secret act. Let us draw these lines directly from the past to the present. The Persian royal road, that ancient information highway built for the king's eyes, finds its direct descendant in the internet. Both are infrastructures of immense economic value that were swiftly co-opted by states as the primary channels for moving secrets and projecting influence. Where Persian couriers raced between relay stations, today's data packets race between servers, but the purpose of monitoring, control, and rapid response is identical. The Roman Frumentarii, those supply clerks turned imperial enforcers, have their clear parallel in modern internal security agencies. Their dual role, managing official logistics while simultaneously conducting audits and covert investigations, mirrors how contemporary organizations can blend administrative function with intelligence gathering, a reality that continues to spark debates about oversight and civil liberties. The ancient arms race of cryptography, from the Caesar shift to invisible inks, is the direct precursor to today's global encryption debates. The fundamental tension is unchanged: a state's desire to read the communications of its adversaries and police its populace versus the individual's need for privacy and secure commerce. When modern governments debate backdoors into messaging apps, they are revisiting the same struggle between open secrets and closed codes that played out in the wax tablets and hollow staffs of the ancient world. Perhaps the most striking parallel is in the use of diplomatic cover. The Byzantine practice of sending clerics and ambassadors who doubled as intelligence officers is standard procedure in modern embassies worldwide. Diplomatic pouches protected by international law and the social access granted to envoys create the same sanctioned shadows where spies can operate in plain sight, gathering information under a cloak of legitimacy. This historical perspective reveals enduring patterns of state behavior. The ancient drive to map resources and choke points is now executed with satellite imagery and economic analysts, but the goal of turning geography into a tool of control is unchanged. The psychological warfare waged through rumors in a besieged city is now waged through social media disinformation campaigns, targeting the same human vulnerabilities of fear and doubt. Understanding these ancient systems does more than satisfy historical curiosity. It answers the pressing question of why this matters now. It teaches us that the flash of new technology often obscures the slow pulse of ancient strategy. It reminds us that behind every algorithm and firewall, the most critical element remains the human source, the handler, the analyst making a judgment call, just as it was in the courts of Darius and the forums of Rome. Seeing these patterns allows us to be more discerning observers of our own time, to recognize that the silent architectures of power have deep, deep roots. The next time you read about a data breach or a diplomatic expulsion, look beyond the headlines. You are witnessing the latest move in the oldest game, a game whose rules were written not in silicon, but in stone and scroll by the unseen hands that first learned how to hold a world together with secrets. The stage lights flicker over an Athenian audience, roaring with laughter as a character on stage cowers, terrified of a notorious informer. This scene from Aristophanes' comedy The Knights is more than ancient slapstick. It is a direct mirror held up to the anxieties of everyday life. The shadowy figures who moved through the real corridors of power also walked boldly onto the stages and pages of ancient art, becoming enduring archetypes that reveal how societies processed the unsettling reality of covert power. Classicists note that from the earliest epics to popular theater, the spy, the informer, and the trickster were constant presences, reflecting a deep cultural fascination with the moral ambiguity of secrets and the people who trade in them. In the Greek tradition, no figure embodies this more completely than Odysseus, the polytropos, the man of many turns. His entire saga is a masterclass in covert operation, from devising the Trojan horse, an act of strategic deception on a colossal scale, to his countless disguises during his long voyage home. He is not a villain, but the ultimate hero of cunning, celebrated for using his intellect and capacity for deception to survive and triumph where brute force fails. This portrayal reveals a culture that valued strategic intelligence as a form of heroic virtue, even as it feared its corrupting influence closer to home. The Roman literary take was often darker and more satirical. Writers like Juvenal and Tacitus painted informers, often alluding to figures like the Frumentarii, as greedy, sinister parasites who poisoned social trust for personal gain. They were stock villains in the public imagination, symbols of imperial overreach and the corrosion of traditional values. This literary condemnation served as a form of social commentary and subtle resistance, a way for the elite to critique the power structures that watched them. In contrast, the ancient Indian epics present espionage as a noble and necessary duty. The Mahabharata is filled with spies and scouts, like the master of disguise Shikundi, whose actions are depicted as essential components of righteous warfare and statecraft. Here, the spy is not an object of ridicule or fear, but a skilled professional operating within a cosmic moral framework, his work integral to fulfilling dharma or sacred duty. The Hebrew Bible offers yet another perspective, where intelligence gathering is frequently framed within a divine plan. The book of Joshua's account of the two spies sent to Jericho is a foundational story. Rahab, the woman who shelters them, is not portrayed as a traitor, but as an actor in a larger providential narrative, her faith and actions rewarded. The spies themselves are instruments of Israel's destiny, their mission sanctified. These varied portrayals served powerful cultural functions. They could be propaganda, glorifying a state's own intelligence efforts while demonizing those of rivals. They served as moral lessons, exploring the tensions between loyalty and betrayal, duty and deception. And they provided social commentary, allowing writers to safely critique powerful institutions by mocking the informer or warning of the corrupting nature of secret power. Consider the enduringly complex figure of Delilah from the Book of Judges. Her story is typically simplified as one of personal betrayal for money, yet viewed through the lens of intelligence, her role shifts. She is an agent operating against a foreign champion who has terrorized her people. Her successful extraction of the secret of Samson's strength, leading to his capture, is a textbook intelligence operation achieved through intimate access. The biblical narrative condemns her act, yet it also places it within a cycle of conflict, making her a potent symbol of how espionage blurs the lines between personal motive and political consequence, between villainy and tactical service. These stories did more than entertain. They shaped how entire civilizations understood the invisible forces influencing their world. They transformed the silent architect from a hidden bureaucrat into a mythic hero, a cautionary villain, or an instrument of the divine. Long before the modern spy thriller, ancient audiences were already grappling with the suspense and moral complexity of a life lived in the shadows, proving that the most compelling characters are often the ones who operate just out of sight. A single line in a crumbling Hittite tablet speaks of a network of the silent ones, its purpose lost to the ages. For every secret service we can trace through history, there are countless others that vanished without a whisper, leaving behind only tantalizing gaps in our understanding. The very nature of covert work means the most successful networks were designed to leave no trace, and the passage of millennia has only deepened the mystery. Historians like those studying the ancient Mediterranean note that some of our greatest blanks come from the deliberate erasure of rivals. Before Rome razed Carthage to the ground, it was a maritime and commercial superpower, its influence stretching across the Western Mediterranean. We know it must have possessed a formidable intelligence apparatus to manage its trade empire and wage its epic wars against Rome. Yet when the city fell, its libraries and records were destroyed or scattered. The full sophistication of Carthaginian spycraft, how they monitored their vast commercial network or infiltrated the Roman Senate, is a ghost in the historical machine, known only by its absence. Similar shadows hang over other lost systems. In the Americas, the Inca Empire operated the chasqui, a legendary relay of runners who could carry messages along the spine of the Andes with incredible speed. But the precise codes they used, the nature of the intelligence they carried beyond official decrees, and how this system was integrated with the Incas' own methods of internal surveillance died with the empire's collapse. We see the infrastructure, but not the secrets that flowed through it. These historical gaps present us with specific, haunting questions. How extensive was the personal spy network of Alexander the Great, whose conquests moved with such precise, rapid strikes? Ancient sources hint at his use of scouts and agents, but the full architecture of his intelligence, which welded Greek, Persian, and Indian methods, remains largely speculative. In China, the Qin dynasty's infamous burning of books and burial of scholars is often framed as a brutal act of ideological control. But could it also have been a devastating act of counterintelligence, an attempt to erase not just philosophies, but the hidden records and communication methods of rival states, consolidating all secret knowledge under the emperor alone? And how did seemingly decentralized nomadic empires, like the Xiongnu Confederation that challenged Han China, organize intelligence across the steppes? Without fixed capitals or vast archives, their methods of communication and espionage must have been brilliantly adapted to mobility. yet they left few written clues for us to follow. The hope for answers lies in the slow, patient work of discovery. Every new archaeological find has the potential to rewrite our understanding. The decipherment of a previously unknown script, like that of the Indus Valley civilization, could one day reveal manuals of statecraft that include espionage protocols. A cache of preserved letters from a border fort, like the Vindolanda tablets, might suddenly shed light on a neighboring empire's covert activities. Consider the enduring enigma of the Nazca lines in Peru, those vast geoglyphs etched into the desert floor. Their most famous forms are visible only from high above. While many theories focus on astronomical or ritual purposes, some researchers have proposed they could have functioned as a sophisticated signaling or landmark system. Could certain lines have directed runners along specific paths, or served as fixed points for communication across the vast, empty landscape? Whether true or not, the mystery itself is instructive. It challenges us to look at ancient landscapes not just as homes or battlefields, but as potential canvases for covert communication, designed for a perspective we are only now learning to see. These unresolved mysteries are not failures of history, but its essential engine. They remind us that the silent war was often too silent for its own records to survive, and that the most compelling chapters of this story are still waiting patiently to be read. Silk from China, pepper from India, and silver from Rome moved along routes that spanned continents, connecting millions in a web of exchange that historians now call the first age of globalization. But this early global system was fragile, a delicate lattice of trust stretched across deserts and seas. What invisible force kept it from shattering? The answer lies not in the goods themselves, but in the silent systems that made their movement possible. World historians like Craig Benjamin describe this interconnected sphere as the Afro-Eurasian world system, a network of exchange that predated modern globalization by 2,000 years. Its stability was not an accident, it was engineered. Beneath the visible hardware of merchant ships and caravan trails ran a critical layer of stabilizing firmware, the covert intelligence networks of empires. These hidden systems performed four essential functions that allowed globalization to flourish. First, they secured the trade routes themselves. Bandits in mountain passes and pirates in narrow straits were constant threats. Persian inspectors on the Royal Road and Roman naval patrols in the Mediterranean acted as a deterrent, but more importantly, the intelligence gathered by merchant spies allowed authorities to anticipate trouble, direct security forces, and keep the lifeblood of commerce flowing. Second, these networks facilitated complex diplomacy. When a Roman envoy approached the Parthian court, or a Chinese delegation reached a Central Asian kingdom, they did not arrive blind. Their strategies were informed by background reports from agents who had traveled ahead, detailing local customs, political factions, and the personal ambitions of rulers. This intelligence turned fraught first contact into calculated negotiation, building the alliances and treaties that framed peaceful exchange. Third, they suppressed large-scale revolts that could sever entire routes for generations. A rebellion in a key province was not just a local problem, it was a systemic failure that could collapse trade for 1,000 miles in every direction. The rapid response enabled by imperial courier networks and internal spies aimed to quell such disruptions before they could unravel the wider web. This leads to the fourth and most profound function, managing diversity. The Afro-Eurasian world system was a mosaic of languages, religions, and ethnicities. Covert intelligence provided the central state with a way to perceive this staggering complexity. Through the reports of its eyes and ears, its Frumentarii, and its wandering monks, an empire developed what we might call an imperial consciousness. It was a way for the brain in the capital to feel the distant limbs of its realm, to sense the pulse of discontent in one region or the prosperity in another, and to adjust its policies accordingly. Think of it as the nervous system of a vast organism. The trade routes were the circulatory system, carrying the nutrients of goods and ideas. But the intelligence networks were the sensory and motor nerves, transmitting signals of pain from a troubled frontier or pleasure from a thriving market town back to the central brain. Without this constant, quiet flow of information, the organism would be paralyzed, unable to respond to infection or injury, and would eventually collapse. This is the grand synthesis and the ultimate historical significance of the silent architects. They did not just hold individual empires together, they wove the separate empires into a stable, interactive whole. They provided the security, the knowledge, and the responsive governance that lowered risk just enough for a merchant in Antioch to send his goods east with a reasonable hope of profit, and for a family in Chang'an to enjoy spices from an island they could not name on a map they had never seen. The first age of globalization was built on trust, but that trust was underwritten by secrets. The hidden networks ensured that the world, for all its vastness and difference, could function as a single, interconnected stage. We have journeyed through the shadows of history, from the watchful eyes of the Persian king to the coded messages of the Arthashastra, uncovering the silent sinews that bound the ancient world's greatest empires. The key takeaway is profound yet simple. Long before digital surveillance, human ingenuity crafted sophisticated systems of information control that were essential to power, stability, and even early globalization. These networks remind us that understanding the past requires looking not only at the visible monuments and battles, but also at the invisible flows of information and trust. As the historian John Keegan noted, intelligence is the missing dimension of most military history, and indeed of most political history. The marble columns and golden coins we see in museums tell only half the story. The other half is written in whispers, in the loyalty of a distant agent, and in the speed of a courier's horse. These were the true pillars upon which empires rested, a hidden architecture of knowledge that turned chaos into order and distance into control. Reflect on how these ancient patterns of secrecy, deception, and information warfare echo in our modern world. The debates we have today about privacy, surveillance, and the weaponization of truth are not new. They are the latest chapter in a very old story. The silent architects of antiquity drafted a blueprint for power that we are still following, whether we realize it or not. Their legacy urges us to be more discerning consumers of information, to look beyond the surface of events and ask what unseen forces might be shaping the narrative. If you found this exploration of history's hidden wiring fascinating, subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of our past. Let us know in the comments which ancient intelligence service you find most compelling. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is always more than meets the eye.